Welcome to the Travelman Podcast. My name is Ben and I host this cool travel podcast. If you're joining me for the first time, then I say thank you for listening. On today's awesome episode, I'll be chatting to Michael Turtle, who is an Australian travel blogger who's attempting to see every UNESCO World Heritage site on the planet. So far, he's seen over 300 of the 1,000 plus UNESCO sites there are. So sit back and enjoy Michael and I chat about travel and the UNESCO World Heritage sites. All right, Michael, thank you very much for joining us today on the podcast.
My pleasure. Lovely to be here. Yeah, I'm great.
You're in Sydney, yeah?
I am in Sydney, yeah.
How's the weather there? Are you still getting affected by the fires?
It's raining today, actually, for the first time in quite a while. So I think it's a welcome relief for people. It's been pretty crazy here for the past few weeks. Lots of smoke haze and weird temperatures. You know, everyone's been hearing about it. Obviously, in centre of Sydney hasn't been too bad, but yeah, we're hopefully at the end of it now.
Yes. Yeah, we've had a bit of rain here in Melbourne as well, so it's been good, but I don't think it hit Gippsland, where all the fires are in Victoria, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know. It's all around the country it's been affected, hasn't it? It's it's been quite a sad situation, but
yeah, it has been. It's been really upsetting, but hopefully we do get the rain that we need. We can put out all those fires, but talking about rain and fires, Australia actually has quite a bunch of UNESCO World Heritage sites, but I don't know, should we talk about that at the start or do you want to do that at the end?
We can talk about that now. Sure, why not?
Right. All right, let's do it, because I was looking through the list of UNESCO World Heritage sites that we have in Australia. Apparently we have 20.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so maybe I'll read them all out and you let me know if you've gone to them and what you think of them. What do you reckon?
I will stop you now. I haven't actually been to a lot of them because, because Australia has lots of sort of quite interesting and unique ones. I think it's probably important that before we sort of dive into the detail to understand what a World Heritage Site is, and there are two types of World Heritage Site. You know,
Sure.
There can be a cultural World Heritage Site, or there can be a natural World Heritage Site. And technically, there's actually a third category, which is a mix between the two. But effectively, there are just two types. And so Australia has 20, which is actually a really large number for a country that only has a couple of centuries of built heritage. And so most of Australia's ones are actually natural World Heritage Sites, but that means that they're sort of in weird, obscure places. You have to sort of go right into the centre of the country to find some of these landscapes, as opposed to a lot of the European countries where every second town or city is effectively a World Heritage Site, and you can just jump on a bus or a train and get to the next one. So, it's I think to sort of see all 20 of Australia's ones, or even probably to see half of them, would be quite an undertaking for any one person.
Yeah, well, that's pretty true. But I think if you're a tourist to Australia, you probably could see a couple when you come here, because Great Barrier Reef is one of them. Oh yeah,
of course. I mean,
popular destination.
Yeah. I mean, some of Australia's biggest tourism sites are World Heritage Sites. Great Barrier Reef, like you say. Uluru is another one.
That's right.
There are actually effectively 3 in Sydney that you can reach. So, most international tourists come through Sydney, and you can get to sort of 3 of them pretty easily. Do you know what they are? Should I start quizzing you, maybe?
Yeah, quiz me. All right, I think I know what they are. So is one Lord Howe Island?
Well, that is actually a World Heritage Site. I mean, not easily accessible from Sydney. I was thinking of the 3 in Sydney. Do you know what they are?
3 in Sydney. Oh, well.
In Sydney, yeah.
You know what? I don't think I do. Oh, well, is one the old government house in Parramatta?
Good Good work. It kind of is in a weird way. There's a site called Australian Convict Sites, which is actually made up of 9 different locations around the country, and
I didn't see that.
The main ones are in Sydney. So it's the barracks, Hyde Park Barracks, and some stuff around the rocks. And is it Parramatta? It's Old Government House, I think it's called, which is the one out in Parramatta, I think. Yeah.
I know one of the sites was the Blue Mountains.
Yes, that's right. So that's the second one that you can access from Sydney. And then the third one is, it's kind of obvious in a way, our most iconic landmark in the whole country, perhaps, which is the Opera House. There you go.
The Opera House, yes. Fantastic place.
Yeah, how could we forget?
House.
Yeah.
No one can forget that. That is a beautiful piece of work. That's a beautiful design. I love the curves at the top. It looks like, did they say it was supposed to look like waves or something like that?
Yeah, it kind of does, doesn't it? Yeah, but like all good art or architecture, you can interpret it however you want. Perhaps it's the top of a cockatoo's head, those sort of feathers or something. True. I don't think so, but it could be.
I think Victoria only has 2 World Heritage sites. I think one is the Royal Exhibition Building in Carlton.
Yes, Carlton that's right.
Gardens, yeah. I think, in Carlton, right next door to it.
Yeah, they're kind of combined into one. So it's all very technical. So something can be called a World Heritage site, but it actually can have multiple locations. There are some where the locations actually stretch across different countries. Even you can have one World Heritage site across 8 different countries in different continents, even just because of the way they define them. So it's quite interesting.
Really?
Victoria does have another one, actually. Victoria has a new one just 6 months or so ago. It was added to the list called I don't know if I'm going to get the pronunciation right, but it's Budgebim. I think it's pronounced. It's an Indigenous site. In fact, the only one of Australia's World Heritage sites that is completely to do with Indigenous heritage, and it's an old aquaculture site. So it's the way Indigenous people used the water and the rivers to catch fish and things. It's quite interesting. I haven't been there, but it sounds really interesting, actually.
It does sound really interesting. I'll have to try and get myself there. But in relation to the UNESCO World Heritage sites, how often do they add new sites?
Too often for my liking, because it makes my my challenge to see them all even harder. But once a year, so they have a meeting once a year around June or July normally, and they sort of assess the new ones that have been put to them, and they say yay or nay, or it's not quite ready. Come back in a year or two, and we'll have a look at it again. And then there's no set number, but on average, tends to be about 20 new ones each year that they add.
Wow. And what's the panel like? Who gets to choose what's a UNESCO World Heritage Sites? What's the criteria?
Oh, good question. So it's actually quite a long process. So I think the first thing that it's important to understand is there isn't like some magical person or a little committee at UNESCO who just goes around the world and says, oh, let's add that one, let's add that one. The process actually has to start from the country itself. So, in Budgebim's case, Australia had to say, we want this place within our country to be considered. And so they put together all the sort of documentation, which is very complicated because it involves not just why it's a great place, but, how it's protected and the management plans and all the kind of thing that bureaucracy loves to see. And then they kind of say we would like this to be added, and then there's normally a minimum of a 2-year process for it to be assessed. And there are international experts who aren't part of UNESCO but are sort of employed or contracted by UNESCO to go and do the assessments. They come and they look and they ask questions or whatever, and then they sort of put together a recommendation. And then once a year, there is the World Heritage Committee, which is made up of a selection of ambassadors from the countries that are in UNESCO. They get together. It's it's almost like a parliament. There's sort of huge big conference room with. Have you ever seen like anything from the UN? Where someone sits there with their little label in front saying their country name and a whole bunch of sort of people in suits, whatever, sitting behind them. It's a bit like that, and then they sit there and they argue, and then they vote in the end. And there has to be a majority from this committee. I don't remember. I think it's about 20. Maybe about 20 countries or so that are normally on it, maybe a few more. And they vote, and then if it's accepted, it becomes a site.
Fantastic. That's really interesting.
Politics,
it is. It's absolutely, it's all politics, isn't it, when you think about it? And does the site have to be a certain age for it to be considered a UNESCO World Heritage Site?
No, I mean, technically no. There's normally a sort of understanding that you wouldn't add something that is still evolving. I mean, it doesn't mean it's not still in use, but there are different reasons why something might be listed as a World Heritage Site, and so I suppose that reason has to become clear. So, there are very old ones, like the Acropolis in Greece, or the pyramids in Egypt. You sort of know why they are what they are, and it's very easy to say
absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Let's add them. But there are modern ones, within the last few decades or so, that might represent a particular architectural style. For instance, just trying to think of one off the top of my head. In Germany, there's one that represents the Bauhaus. Sorry?
The Brandenburg Gate?
No, actually, that isn't one, interestingly.
Oh, really?
I was thinking of... No, it's not. I don't know why not. I was thinking, actually, of the Bauhaus architectural style and design style. There's a couple of buildings there that were sort of where it was all developed and represent them the best. And so even though they're, less than 100 years old, they've been added to the list because it's sort of quite easy to define. This was the architectural style of the time. Nothing's going to change that, and so we can make it a site. Whereas anything that's made, like you might not add New York City, for instance, because it's sort of a hard one to define at the moment because it's still changing, it's still evolving. What does it represent? At some point, though, you might sort of say, okay, well, all these skyscrapers have sort of been heritage listed in their own right. They're not changing. So now we could list New York City and say it is a perfect example of this period in US and global history when cities became, metropolises with skyscrapers or that kind of thing. That kind of makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. You're saying so the whole, nearly all of Manhattan would be a UNESCO World Heritage Site?
It was just an example, but it could be, yeah. I mean, you have the whole centre of Vienna is a World Heritage Site.
I didn't know that. Wow.
There are quite a lot of cities, actually, where they basically almost just draw a line around, what was the centre of the city and then say this now is all protected because it represented a particular period in time or a particular style. There's actually a bit of controversy with Vienna. They want to build a new building there, and UNESCO says if you do that, we'll delist you because we've protected this whole area. You can't just go building new skyscrapers there. So it's a bit of controversy,
absolutely.
Actually.
I totally understand that. Now, I've got you on pretty much because you're going to talk on UNESCO World Heritage Sites, but also because you want to visit every UNESCO World Heritage Site that's ever been built. Now, so what are you up to? You're up to 300 plus, aren't you?
Oh, yeah. Good point, actually. I don't know my exact count. There's definitely 300 plus. Let me look up. I've got a little list here that will tell me the exact number. I haven't been to one in a couple of months, so I forget. 314 it is. There you go.
314. And do you know exactly how many currently UNESCO World Heritage Sites there are in the world?
Oh, yes, sadly I do, because, it's the countdown. There are currently 1,121, which is a lot, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, geez. How are you going to visit them all?
I mean, just between you and I and, dear listener here, reality is probably I won't ever because it is, but I'll definitely be able to get another, 500 or 600, I reckon, up to before I start running into trouble.
But then if they're adding another 20 each per year,
well,
trying to think.
Especially if it's in obscure countries that you've already been to. You don't want to necessarily go back to Kiribati for a second time, do you? Or back to Sierra Leone or something like that, just because they've added a new one.
But technically, though, if you've already been there and you've gone to that, say, site before it was a UNESCO site, and then it becomes a UNESCO site later on, it means you've already
count
seen it.
Yeah, I definitely count it. And in fact, you can again, it's a bit like, it's not just politics, but there's a bit of a game in all of this. You can actually predict a little bit in advance which ones are likely to become them. Just because, as I was explaining, that process is so long, there's normally at least, well, it's definitely a few years minimum, sometimes even longer, where you can sort of look ahead and say, okay, that's the one that country is going to nominate and try to get listed. So, yeah, if you're near it, then you make an effort to go and see it.
Michael, do you remember the first UNESCO World Heritage site that you saw?
I've tried to actually think about this before. I mean, I probably couldn't tell you the first one I ever saw in my life because,
okay, no, that's cool.
I wouldn't have probably known what it was. Although, having grown up in Sydney, it was probably the Opera House was probably technically the answer. But the first one I ever saw when I sort of started doing this full time, when I started traveling full time and writing about them, I didn't actually know that I was going to start this challenge to try and see them all first of all. So I wasn't really taking note, but I've been able to look back and think, what was the first one I went to when I started writing and traveling? And it would have been Yosemite National Park in the US, which I didn't know was one at the time, but it is, and that would have been it, which is kind of a big one to start with. I think
absolutely
one that lots of people have been to. You don't necessarily know that it does have this special designation. It's kind of a cool place.
That's
actually
a natural wonder, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The US is similar to Australia in that sense. They've got what have they got? 20 something. I can't remember exactly what they've got. About the same as us, really. But most of them are natural. Yeah.
The natural, unlike I think probably 3/4 of are natural for us, and maybe just a quarter are buildings and so forth.
Yeah, in Australia there are 4 out of our 20. There are only 4 that are entirely man-made ones. And we've mentioned all of them already. I think the Opera House, Royal Exhibition Building in Melbourne, Budge Bim, and the convict sites. So they're the only 4 that are man-made. The rest are natural. And then a few of them are what we call mixed. So, but that's most of them, I think, are all to do with Indigenous heritage. So things like Kakadu, it's mainly natural, but it's actually a mixed one because there is some sort of man-made, in quotes, some heritage there to do with paintings and carvings and so on.
No, that's fair enough. And do you reckon, as the traveller or person that's listening today, the chances of them having already seen a UNESCO site and not knowing and not realising is pretty high?
For sure. For sure. I think anyone who's travelled at all has probably come across one. Because, they're not, nowhere is made a World Heritage Site because it is famous or because it's a tourist attraction. But, a lot of the reasons that places are famous and are tourist attractions are the same reasons that they might become a World Heritage Site. So, if you've ever been to London, you would have seen a couple. If you've ever been to New York, you would have seen a couple. If you've ever been, I'm trying to think of these other big cities that people might go to, and even if you've just travelled around without realising it, you've probably come to some as well. Where have you been? Where was the last place you went, for instance?
Well, okay. The last place I was Singapore. Have they got
Singapore
one?
has one. They have one. It's although it's not somewhere you would necessarily go, but it's the botanical gardens there.
Oh
not
my
the
God, I love that garden. The botanical
not the
garden.
modern. Yeah, not the big modern one with the fake trees, but the sort of the more traditional botanical garden there.
Yes.
So if you've been to the sort of traditional botanical gardens there, the one that was set up in the colonial days, then you've been to one.
Okay. Well, I reckon I've gone to quite a few, so I have travelled around the world a lot. But I never think about it when I'm there. If it's a UNESCO site, I just go, "Wow, that's a really awesome looking building," or "That's a great site." I never think, "Oh, I wonder if that's a UNESCO site." Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it was hard to avoid them in Europe, to be honest. If anyone's ever travelled through any country in Europe and done anything slightly touristy, you've probably been to dozens of them without realising. There are so many there. There's actually a real bias, and this is something that is quite interesting, again, that UNESCO itself has acknowledged as a problem, that there are far too many in Europe and in North America compared to the rest of the world. But, good for tourists, I guess, who go there.
So do you think in the back of their mind they want to balance it out and favour, say, South America, Australia, Asia, Middle East, Africa?
Definitely, and not even in the back of their mind. As I say, they're quite sort of open about this, that, for whatever reasons, historically or, bureaucratically, politically, there has become this imbalance. So UNESCO has divided the world into sort of certain regions, and one of them they call collectively Europe and North America, which are obviously not geographically close, but what they mean by that is kind of the developed countries that kind of have a lot more power. They together have, I looked this up because I was curious, 47% of the World Heritage sites in the world. And there is lots of
that's quite a number.
There's lots of culture in Europe, so I mean it's not surprising they have a lot. But then you compare it to somewhere like Africa, an enormous continent with tens of thousands of years of history, and they have 9% of the World Heritage sites. Absolutely tiny for a huge continent that was probably the first place that man ever existed. So there's obviously an imbalance there. Latin America, which has not just sort of a lot of heritage from the colonial period over the last 500 or 600 years, but again, millennia of amazing and interesting civilizations and empires there. Latin America and the Caribbean together only have 13%. So there's a real imbalance there, and I think
unbelievable.
You can't just sort of click a finger and change that. But they're definitely aware of it and trying to do as much as they can to change it.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. Now, I've just thought of myself as a listener. And as a listener, I'm like, Ben, what's the UNESCO World? What does UNESCO stand for? What does UNESCO stand for? So I'm thinking I better ask you that. What's UNESCO stand for?
Oh, God, I didn't know there was going to be a quiz. It is. No, I do know it is.
I'll give you 5 minutes to look it up.
No, I know it. Obviously, the UN bit is easy. United Nations.
Yep.
It's United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. That's what it is. Yeah.
You've just won $100.
Am I right? I think I'm right. Yes. No, I'm right.
Yeah. I'm guessing you're right.
No, it is. I always get a bit confused about what every letter, because it doesn't, it's not an obvious thing.
Yeah.
Like the UN, WTO, World Tourism Organization, you know what it stands for, but the E and the S and the C, they could stand for anything.
And WWF, Worldwide Federation? I never know what that means.
Right.
It's wrestling, World Wrestling Fed.
I don't.
That's right. We could do this all day.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Play the acronym game,
yeah. Well, okay, so what's the most memorable site you visited?
That's interesting, actually, because, up to 300 and so now, there are lots that are sort of memorable in the sense that they're amazing places. So like you can't go to the Taj Mahal or Machu Picchu or Angkor Wat, for instance, and not kind of, be awestruck by them and remember them. But they're not memorable because they were a World Heritage site. They're just memorable because they were kind of like impressive places. And there's always, like, when I think about like memorable World Heritage sites, there's like one that I always think of, probably because it was one of the first I went to that was somewhere I only went to because it was a World Heritage site, if that makes sense. Like I went out of my way to go and see it. It was
that makes sense.
Yeah, it was in Chile, and it's called the Sul mining town. Sul spelled Sewell, Sul mining town. And it was so it was this mining town up in the Andes in Chile. And it was founded in just after 1900, I think 1905, 1906, something like that. Basically, there was a mine there, and so the mining company had to create somewhere for all the miners to live. So they built a mining town up in the mountains here. And then over the sort of decades it grew, and it went from a few houses into houses and shops, and then from houses and shops into schools and playgrounds and theatres and a hospital. And anyway, so this quite large town was created up in the mountains, but it was actually like on a side of a mountain. So I don't think of like a normal town. There were no roads, for instance, because it was too steep to have roads. So there were just staircases that would go between everything here. And then because the Andes in this part of Chile are pretty bleak, just sort of grey, brown, dirt places, the residents painted all the buildings different colours. So one will be bright blue, and the next one will be bright pink, and the next one will be bright yellow. And so sort of as you approach this town, you see all these sort of colours sort of contrasted against the bleak mountains there. Anyway, so it grew and grew and grew, lots of people living there. And then the company finished up, the mine closed in late 70s it was. So the town existed for probably about 70 years. Town closed, and I think a few of the places were demolished, but basically it just wasn't touched because there was no need to touch it. So you've got this, and it's since been sort of preserved by people who care about heritage. And so you've got this sort of town that just sat there frozen in time for the last 40 years or so, that sort of grew in this really harsh environment, but was full of colour and fun. Anyway, it takes a long time to get there. It's not an obvious thing to do. And so I remember it because I was like, why am I on the ride up there in the little minibus that I thought the only way to get there is with a tour. And so I was just in a little that picks you up in the morning and takes you there and brings you back. So I was in the minibus going up there. So thinking, why am I doing this? Like, I'm in the middle of nowhere. It's taken me a day to kind of get to the town where the minibus will pick me up from. I'm going up here. This is such a silly thing to be doing. And then you get there and you sort of discover this place that probably 99.999% of the population of the world has never heard of, let alone will ever go to. And it's just a really cool, crazy place. And, I wouldn't have gone out of my way to see it if I wasn't trying to do this challenge. That's why I still remember this one. That was the first one where I'm like, yes, I'm justified in doing this. This isn't such a silly thing. There are reasons why this is cool.
For sure. And no one lives there anymore. It was pretty much everyone left.
Yes, it's
like
empty.
A ghost town.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is, a ghost town. So you go into these buildings and they're either sort of empty or, they've still got the tables and chairs and stuff, but they're all covered in dust and stuff. So it's kind of cool.
Wow. That is really cool. No wonder you think about it all the time. I'd probably dream about it and think about a horror film or something.
Yeah, so it was surprisingly unscary, just by everything I've just told you. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Oh, it's very colourful. So, yeah, you don't want to know what type of things scare me. Talking about things that are unsatisfying. What's the most unsatisfying UNESCO site you visited? Something that you've gone, oh, yeah, I can't wait to see that. And it's like, nah, that was pretty crap. If there are any.
No, actually, I had to say it, but there are quite a lot, actually.
What?
Well, I suppose there's a few different types why they're unsatisfying. So like they're all added for a reason, but that reason isn't necessarily visually spectacular or even particularly boring. So like an example would be in the Netherlands. There's one called the Beemsterpolder. But basically, the reason it's sort of important is because it was once sort of marshland or whatever how you describe it, all covered in water, and the Dutch used quite ingenious technology to pump the water out of it, so it could be used for farming and residential areas, which is actually very cool that they invented this technology and were able to do this. But it means you go there and it's a field. Basically, because the reason it's famous is because they made it normal. So you go there and you're like, oh wow, a big field and lots of farms and a few houses. Like, wow, that's kind of cool.
Is there a plaque in the ground that says this is a UNESCO site?
Oh, they've got a visitor centre. I remember going into the visitors. Yeah, I remember going into the visitor centre and saying, oh wow, I'm here. I've come because it's a World Heritage site. What should I see? And they're like, oh, the field. go for a walk around, have a look. I was like, yeah, okay, I will, thanks. There are some that I think are really really important and have a lot of potential, but then aren't done very well as well. I always think of when I was in South Africa going to Robben Island, the jail on the island off the coast of Cape Town where Nelson Mandela, among many other people, were held prisoner. And it means such an important place in historical terms, and there's still a lot to see there, and it should be very emotional, but I think they don't do it very well. They basically put you on a bus and drive you around and kind of point at things and then let you out into one building, and there's a guide, but you're normally in a group of 50 or 60 people and you can't hear him properly. And anyway, the problem is the way that it's managed. So that's the other thing that can sort of make a site unsatisfying. And then I think there are also some that just between you and me again, I don't think are really worthy of being one. Some countries have a bit of a desire just to have as many as possible, to sort of be at the top of the list and be beating out their rival countries. And Germany is one of them. And Germany has very many. They have lots and lots of amazing World Heritage sites. They've got some of the most in the world, and they're really good. But I think there are a couple that sort of slip through that aren't particularly good. So there's one that they call the Martin Luther Memorials. And so basically they're places that are to do with Martin Luther, who 500 years ago, as you know, probably protested against the Catholic Church and started the splinter movement that became the Protestant Church. So, he's a very, very important person, and what he did is very, very important in terms of global history. But what they did was kind of say, well, this is the house that he was born in, and this is the house that he died in. And here are kind of couple of places that have something to do with his life. We're going to make that a site. And it's rather underwhelming because it's not the house that he was born in that is important. It's him and what he did. So they kind of, cheated a bit there, I think, and made a site that isn't really that interesting in that sense. It's not interesting to visit necessarily, interesting to learn his story, but you don't need a site for that.
Okay. No, that's fair enough. I don't know, I always thought that a UNESCO site had to be pretty, had to be good. I don't know why I thought that, but obviously it's not the truth.
No, it's the ones that you go to tend to be pretty, which is why you sort of think that, you sort of, the correlation is there in your brain, but it's not actually there in reality. Really something becomes a World Heritage Site because it is significant, because it represents an important part of human history. I sometimes think of it as like if you could create a gallery or a museum of places that tell our story as humanity, then it would be the World Heritage List. So something, it doesn't have to be amazing to look at, but it can be the best, the first or the best example of a particular construction style, or best representation of a religion or of a civilization that once existed, or so on. So, quite often those places are cool to visit. The best church of this religion during this century is probably going to be a cool place to see. The capital of an ancient civilization could be cool to see, but it also could be ruins these days. So it actually might be really unimpressive to visit, but it's still significant and important. So it gets added to the list. So that's kind of the way that, you need to look at it. And they don't often add things that, multiple things, if they don't need to. You don't need the 10 best churches showing 17th century French Renaissance style or whatever. You just need the one or the two that represent it best, unless the other ones also have something else that's unique or special about them.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you could really pump up the amount of World UNESCO Heritage sites in France for with all the castles they have, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. So they don't just add something because it is a castle or a pretty castle. They sort of say, well, what is significant about this one, or what is an important part of our heritage or history that we want to kind of protect now, which is the best castle that represents that.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah, and actually recently, again, to sort of go back a little bit to what I was saying earlier about them, UNESCO being slightly self-aware. It's still a big international organization. They're not overly self-aware, but slightly self-aware, and realizing that they're sort of adding lots of ones that maybe in hindsight don't deserve to be a site in themselves. They've started trying to collect things together and saying to countries, maybe there are 4 or 5 churches. Let's not make each of them a World Heritage Site. Let's create a World Heritage Site that has the 5 of them as different locations within the site. Like I was saying earlier, you can have one, and they've even done sort of what is it? They've even sort of done these ones that go across different countries. So there's a really interesting one that was added in when was it? Let me just look it up. It was added in 2016. It was just recently, 2016, just a few years ago, and it was the architectural work of an architect called Le Corbusier. I can't pronounce it. Le Corbusier. He was French. It might have been Swiss, actually. I think French Swiss, maybe. But Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier. He worked all around the world, making quite famous buildings, and so rather than making each of these buildings a separate World Heritage Site, they got all these countries together that had buildings that he had designed and said, okay, together you're going to create one World Heritage Site. And so this one World Heritage Site has 17 different locations of buildings that he designed, and they are in Switzerland, Japan, India, Germany, France, Belgium, and Argentina. So they're spread across at least 4 continents. It's quite incredible, actually.
Yeah, that is really incredible. But I like how they do that. I think that's good.
Well, it makes a lot more sense. Yeah. It makes the list a little bit more manageable for us. I cheat a bit. If I've been to one of them, then I say I've been to the whole site. I'm like, tick, good. Yeah.
Well, I think technically, say if you've seen one, that's enough, I reckon.
Well, I tick it off. I tick it off and then say, okay, when I'm in the next country, I'll make an effort to go and see the other part of it. But it's still off the list.
The artist, I think his name's Antoni Gaudi or something like that. The Sagrada Familia.
Yes, yes. So,
are all his works heritage listed?
Some of them are. There is a World Heritage Site that is called the Works of Antoni Gaudi. Okay. I don't know off the top of my head exactly how many of his buildings are. I think it's about 7 or 8 of them, which includes La Sagrada Familia. But then there are other ones. I think most of them are in Barcelona. All of them, in fact, I think are in Barcelona. So they sort of basically, even though he has more than 7, again, they sort of just say, okay, these are the 7 best ones, or these are the 7 that show the variety of his styles and so on. So we'll put them together and call that one site. Okay. It's kind of fun, actually, those ones, because I like that. You can go to a city like Barcelona and actually spend a few days, not maybe all day, every day, but you can spend a few days seeing the one World Heritage Site, because you go to La Sagrada Familia one morning, and then maybe you go to Park Güell that afternoon, and then the next day you plan your itinerary so that you go past a couple of these other kind of houses and so on. That's kind of fun. It's more than just like going, seeing a church, ticking it off, and then leaving.
Yeah, there are some people out there that just tick them off. It's like the Instagrammers that, walk into a country or a city, tick it off, and then leave and go, yep, that's another one off my bucket list of countries and cities I've seen, like up to 187 or whatever.
Oh, yeah. There are people that try and claim that like transiting through the airport counts. I mean, how ridiculous is that?
It's not ridiculous. I always say you've got to spend at least a few days in a city or a country to really try and get the vibe of it.
Yeah, I think so too. But also, why wouldn't you want to do that? I don't get the idea of going somewhere for an hour or two and then ticking it off and getting back on a plane. It's kind of stupid.
Yeah, no, it kind
like
of is.
Liechtenstein or something. Probably Liechtenstein in a few days or a few hours, I mean.
I've been to Luxembourg. That's a pretty small place. I'm guessing that would have a UNESCO site.
Yes, it has. I think only one actually. The capital, Luxembourg City, the old
city
town.
is a
the old town part of it is a World Heritage Site.
I remember having a good beer.
Oh, yes. Do you remember what type it was? Any recommendation?
Yeah, I do actually. And you know what, Michael? I didn't think for a second that it was a UNESCO site. It didn't even register.
There you go. Another one you've got. Look, by the end of this conversation,
God.
you're going to have a whole another 10 or 12 that you've been to without realizing.
I'd be like, Michael, I'm up to 278, mate. I'm thinking of starting a blog.
Yeah. There's actually a little app you can... No, I reckon I'll add this little tip. There's a little app you can get on your phone, which is it's free and it's not made by UNESCO, but it's really, really good. It's just called World Heritage or something. And basically it has like a little map of them all, an interactive map of them all, and you can tick off which ones you've been to, and you can look at either which one's the closest to you, or you can just look on a map, or you can just look by country. And it's really cool. So it gives you a little constant little count. And the map that has the sort of around me thing is the best, because if you're anywhere on holiday, you can just pull up this little map and it will show you all the little markers of which ones are closest to you. And you can say, I didn't know that was. I might just make the effort to, get on a bus or something, or just walk over there and have a look at it. So it's really cool.
With that little, this sounds amazing. You know, with that little map, that app, does it tell you how difficult a UNESCO World Heritage site is to visit, or how close it is to a main city? Does it give you all those little bits and pieces, or does it just say this is where it is this, and it is that, and that's it? Or does it give you like background?
No, it gives you a little bit. It gives you like the historical background, the sort of why it is a site or so on. Yep. But it doesn't. No, it doesn't give you all that stuff for visiting, because that would be cool, wouldn't it? That's sort of the extra stuff you need.
Because then they would say, okay, maybe this site will be really difficult for you to visit, even though we do register it as a UNESCO site. It is hard to visit, and you will have to do this and this and this to get there. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm here for, isn't it? That's that's my job.
That's
now.
Why I've got you on
to give you all that advice. Yeah.
Well, that was my question. It was, what's the most difficult UNESCO site you've ever tried to reach?
There are. Well, I'll tell you in a second about some ones that are really hard to reach. But the most difficult one I've probably tried to reach. There are a couple in South America that were tough, but probably the hardest one I did was actually just last year in Mexico. It's called Calakmul, and it's ancient Mayan city.
Wow.
And in fact was once one of the largest Mayan cities in the world. Tikal, which is in Guatemala, were sort of the metropolises of the Mayan civilization before other ones that are a bit more famous, like Chichen Itza, which is much, much smaller, came into existence. Yeah. But Calakmul it's in Mexico, but it's quite close to the Guatemalan border, and it's in the middle of the jungle near no other big cities. And the only way for me to get there was basically a sort of a 2.5 day expedition there and back, which is maybe not large in terms of some expeditions, but just to sort of go out of my way to go and see a World Heritage site. It was quite large. and so I had to get a bus all day from the closest city into this small town in the middle of a jungle, and it was impossible for me to find anything in advance about how to get there, but I sort of get there, and there's only a couple of guest houses in town, so I check into one of them, and it all becomes quite obvious that it's not going to be actually as difficult as I thought, because the only reason anyone ever stops in this small town and stays in the guest house is because they want to go and visit Calakmul, which is it's still 3 or 4 hours drive from this place. This is just the closest town, but because they know that's why people want to visit it, there's a bit of a side gig for a lot of people in town where they'll just drive you there. And so, it sort of didn't take very long until the owner of the guest house said, do you need to go to Calakmul tomorrow? Because I've already got 3 people in the car, and there's room for a 4th if you want to come. And so, but yeah, it was still then a 3 or 4 hour drive into there. But it's incredible because you get there, and there were probably only I probably saw 10 other tourists the entire time I was there in this enormous ancient city, climbing up these huge stone pyramids. And there was one point where I was in what would have been the sort of public square at one point, with temples and pyramids on every side. And I couldn't see anyone else at this point because I wandered off to take some photos. And a howler monkey starts howling in the trees. And so I'm in the middle of this ancient square with ancient temples, and the howler monkey is just this sort of cry is just echoing around me. It was quite an amazing experience. hard ones to get to are often the best ones to get to because, you're not surrounded by other tourists, and quite often they're quite incredible in their own right as well. But there are other ones, just, before we move on, there are other ones that are actually really, really hard to get to, probably almost impossible to get to, because some of the places in the World Heritage sites are like tiny, remote islands near Antarctica, and so it'd be pretty hard to get to a random island. And in fact, one of them you're not even allowed to go there. They've closed it off, so the nature there won't be disturbed. So unless you're a scientist with a particular mission, you can't even go to that island. There are a couple actually that are closed to the public. So there's one in Brussels called the Stocklet House, which it's just a house, but it's got a very, very cool design. Again, it kind of represents a particular style and movement, but it's privately owned. People live there, and so you can't go inside. You can look at it from the outside. So I've ticked it off for that reason, but you can't go in and see it. And then there are others that are closed to some people. So like Mecca, for instance, is a World Heritage Site, but you're not allowed to go into Mecca unless you're Muslim. So, there are some. So I wouldn't be able to go in and see Mecca properly. And there are some other ones. They're normally religious ones that are closed off to only open to a particular religion, or even some that, women can't go into just because of their history and heritage as well.
So when are you becoming Muslim, mate?
I have actually sort of pondered. It hasn't come up in practice yet, but I have pondered like how you could see Mecca. I don't think converting to Islam just to see it would be appropriate. But
quite the story.
I think you could maybe, if you really believed in it, I think you might want to do it. I would be hesitant to do it just to go and see somewhere if I didn't really believe everything. But anyway, we'll see.
And I was also going to say, talking about visiting that ancient temple, you still got both kidneys?
Yes. Actually, again, I say it was difficult because it did take a long time, and I didn't really know what I was doing because there wasn't much information online. But the other thing is, those ones are actually quite often sort of much safer than you realize. Right. I think Mexico, has a bad reputation for probably for obvious and correct reasons in some respects, but it's a large country, and if you're not up near the border with the US, it's not as bad. And so it was actually very easy and safe and very friendly to kind of go off on a bit of an adventure like that. I don't want anyone to go following my advice and doing that and then getting murdered. I'd feel bad, but in my case, I had no problems at all.
Oh, no, it sounded really interesting, especially that howler monkey going off near you. That would have really scared the shit out of me, I reckon.
Do it first. Because I don't know if you've never heard a howler monkey before, they don't actually sound like howler monkeys. They sound like lions or tigers or something when you first hear them. God. So I was terrified that there was anyway.
I would have definitely been terrified.
First time I heard one, I really didn't know what to do. But it was okay this time.
Sure, and you got back okay? Was there another couple of days to come back to where you were staying?
Oh, I went in a different direction. You can do it. You can actually do a loop, and so it's not so bad. Yeah, it only took a day to get to them where I needed to go, or even less than a day actually. But yeah.
And was that all organised by you?
Yeah. So something like that. I mean, something like that, I potentially would do like a day tour or an overnight tour if I could find one, just because it makes the logistics easier. But there isn't enough interest in going to this site, so it just doesn't exist. Okay. So, I sort of had to and a lot of the information isn't online either. So you also you can't really plan it in advance. So, in the town where I was, a place called Campeche, which is on the west coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, which is a World Heritage Site in itself, which is why I was there. I sort of, took me sort of quite a while just going around and like asking people and at the bus station and at the information place and stuff, trying to work out, find a bus that I could take that would get me to that town that I was talking about. So I eventually found one and got a ticket. And then, as I said, you turn up there at that town, and then you sort of have to do your next step of talking to people and asking around and working out how you're going to get to this temple. And it brought me back. And then when I got back to this town, this is actually probably the hardest bit, was having to negotiate with a taxi driver to take me on to the next bit, because there were no more buses at that time of day. And so it was also they do those share taxis there, if you've ever come across them around the world, where, you sort of, they'll put you in a taxi and then wait until it's full, so there's 4 or 5 people squeezed in. So they're not overly expensive because they sort of split the cost amongst 5 people, but they do like to take advantage of foreigners who don't understand the system and the value and try and rip you off a bit. So there's a lot of sort of haggling. That took a couple of hours until I finally got someone to take me at the right price, which in hindsight I should have just paid the initial amount. It would have been worth it. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm sure it wouldn't have been that expensive, but I guess... Yeah.
No, I think I was arguing between... I probably ended up being like a 4-hour drive in total, and I was arguing between... Right. $15 and $10 or something. So in hindsight, I probably would. But when you're using big numbers in pesos, you don't realize that. You sort of think, no, I'm going to keep haggling here. So until the end, you're like, oh, actually, I would have just paid the $15 or $20, whatever it was initially, probably here, rather than argue for 2 hours and save $10.
Yeah.
But that's part of it. It always becomes principle in those situations, because they're ripping you off. The value is $10, and you're like, no, I'm just not going to let you win here.
Yeah, I got ripped off coming from Ho Chi Minh City into my hotel. I think we ended up paying $85 Australian, and it should have been probably $10.
Oh wow, I always feel. When something like that happens to me, it's not really reasonable, but I always feel so angry. You get that feeling in your stomach of like, oh, I got ripped off, and I'm so furious. And of course, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter. It's not going to ruin your life, but it's just that fact that someone took advantage of you that makes you so angry.
Yeah, well, my wife was pretty angry. She would have killed the guy if she saw him again. So yeah. But I was like, It's happened. There's not much we can do now. Stuff like that happens when you travel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, you do need to have a positive attitude, but it is hard, I think. If it's your own fault, if it's my own fault, I get over something quickly. If I make a mistake, I'm like, oh, well, that was a bit stupid. But if someone else rips me off, I find it harder to get over just because I don't like what it says about people. I'm like, oh, why would someone do that? Like, why would someone cheat me? That's not nice.
Well, exactly.
People are nicer than that, aren't they?
Yeah. You like to think.
Yeah.
Do you know what city or country has the most UNESCO World Heritage sites? You think it's North America? Could it be USA?
Countries I can do. No, do you want to have a guess? USA would probably come in maybe number 10 or something would be my guess off the top of my head. But I know the top ones. So if you want to have a guess, I can tell you how close you are.
I reckon one of the countries must be in Europe. I would say Germany is one of them.
Oh, yeah, Germany's really high. You said that because I mentioned it earlier. But yes, Germany is up there. Germany has the 4th highest number of World Heritage sites. It has maybe 46 of them.
Wow, 46.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, geez, that's lopsided. France?
France has 45. So it's the fifth on the list with 45. Okay. Yeah, Germany and France always have this little battle. I was mentioning earlier how Germany has a few weird ones because they kind of have rivals. It's the German-France rivalry, basically, who can have the most, and they go back and forth each year depending on who gets one that year or not.
Well, that's fair enough. What is United Kingdom thought of as a whole unit?
It is, but it's not. It's up there, but it's not in the top 5. I think it's about. It's about 7 or 8 on the list. I'll give you a clue. You were close when you're talking Germany and France, because you're right. What is a European country that just has at least a couple of thousand years of really intense culture and history all crammed in to the one little country? You name anything that sort of represents a cultural or an architectural or an artistic style, and it probably has something to do with this country somehow.
A small country.
Well, no, I mean not super small, but smaller than Germany and France, I think. Just
Spain.
Good. Spain is number 3 on the list. Yeah, Spain has heaps. Spain has 48. You know what I'm going to tell you, and as soon as I tell you, you're going to go, duh. It's Italy.
Probably will.
Italy has the most.
It didn't even register in my mind.
But it's not. It's not just. I mean, it's got obviously so much art and architecture in it, but also the Roman history gives it a lot as well, and religious history is between religion, art, architecture, Romans. and probably some other stuff as well. There's a lot of World Heritage sites in Italy, and most of them are justified. There isn't much sort of chaff there amongst that wheat. they're all pretty good, incredible places.
Okay. And
the other one I should add, the second one, we missed one though. Sorry, the second on the list though is China, which is a really interesting one because it makes sense because it has so much history and heritage, but most of the Asian countries don't have many World Heritage sites for whatever reason. They've never really seen going through the process as important, it seems. And so, it's interesting that China has seen that as important. Perhaps it's to get geopolitical here. Maybe they see it as, it's a source of pride and, again, trying to be better than other countries. so they made a real effort to nominate sites. So they've got 55, exactly the same as Italy, in fact, these days. I said second because they used to be second, but I forget they're equal this year. Yeah.
I just thought of a question, actually. Can sites be wiped off the list, like either being bombed, destroyed, or maybe just wiped off because they're not really that heritage, not that worthy of being listed anymore or something?
Yeah. So there are two things to say to that. It's a very good question, actually. First is that there is something they call the World Heritage in danger list. I can't remember, World Heritage in danger. Yeah, something like that. So basically, that's something where UNESCO, or this committee that I mentioned earlier, that sort of decides the sites, can also decide to name a site as in danger. And so this can be for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes it can be because of war. I think most of the sites in Syria at the moment are listed as in danger. It can be because of environmental issues. There was a big discussion about whether the Great Barrier Reef would be put on the in danger list, and it only just narrowly avoided it.
Wow.
So the natural ones particularly can get on the list because of environmental issues. Quite often there are sites that get put on there because of sort of stuff that is happening around it. So there's one, I can't remember the specifics, but there are some that get put on the list because a mine will open in the region, or there'll be logging in the region, and these are sort of things that they consider can be in threat. And then there are ones that can be put on the in danger list because the countries or the relevant authorities just aren't looking after them well enough. And so UNESCO will say, you know what, you're not looking after the place. Its heritage value is potentially going to be lost here. So we may put it on the World Heritage in danger list. And then to answer your other bit, there are places that have been taken off the list completely for normally that reason, because they weren't looked after properly. And there are 2.5 that has happened to in the past.
2.5.
I say 2.5 because one of them had two locations. And one of the locations got taken off, and that was in Georgia. There was a cathedral in Georgia that was, along with a monastery, was a World Heritage site, and the cathedral got taken off the list. It's kind of funny though, not because it wasn't looked after, because it was looked after too well, that the Georgian authorities basically sort of did it up. And they did it up to such an extent that not much of the original cathedral was left. And so UNESCO went, well, this kind of is just a new thing now, basically. So we're taking it off the list. Wow. The other ones were in Oman. It was called the Arabian Oryx Sanctuary. And this was sort of a natural one, and that was to do with the environment. There was, I think, poaching and just the environment sort of got ruined there, so they took it off the list. And the other one was in Germany, was the Dresden Valley, I think it was called, and basically the authorities wanted to build a new bridge here, and the bridge was going to ruin the heritage of the valley. And UNESCO said, if you build the bridge, we're going to take this Dresden Valley off the list. And the authorities went, well, we need the bridge. People need to get from A to B. That's more important than it being called a World Heritage site. And so they built the bridge and it got taken off. So it's interesting.
Okay. With the UNESCO World Heritage sites, does it actually generate money for the countries? I mean, other than just tourism value?
No. Other than tourism, it doesn't really. They don't get given money to look after them or anything like that. But a lot of them, do see the tourism value. of them. Again, I think that countries like Germany and France and Spain and China and Italy, I think one of the reasons they have so many is because, as well as, a national pride issue, I think they think that if they make somewhere a World Heritage Site, then more people will visit, and it is a way to kind of promote and boost tourism. And then I think, the flip side is there are some countries that have a lot of places that should be World Heritage Sites, really, but the country itself hasn't bothered to go through the process, and I think they obviously don't see the value. And some of them are sort of trying to fix that now. They go, actually, maybe there is value here. Maybe we will list some more. But yeah, I think it's because they don't get given any money. They don't think tourists will come. There is no reason other than pride in some respects to have one, and so some countries just haven't bothered. Particularly Southeast Asia. There's a lot of places in Southeast Asia that I think should be World Heritage Sites, and those countries haven't really seen the need. But that's changing a bit for some of them.
So there's quite a lot of paperwork for countries to fill in to just nominate a place for UNESCO World Heritage.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge process. Australia, for instance, has a whole section within the Environment Department that just does that kind of thing. So I mean, that's not the only thing they do, but it takes a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of sort of people sort of knowing how it works to do it. And again, just to briefly get back into the politics of it all, one of the reasons that places like the African countries and Latin American countries haven't got as many World Heritage Sites is partly because of this bureaucracy. What a lot of people say is that the bureaucracy has been created in a way that works for Western countries. It's the way that Western countries do bureaucracy, not the way that African countries might do bureaucracy, for instance. So, it's not just a matter of, there are lots of forms to fill out and lots of things to do. It's more that it's not, they don't really understand it because it's not the way they would do it. And so there are some sort of things changing now within the UNESCO system to actually make it easier for people to do this in the way that they would want to do it, the way that they're sort of more comfortable doing it.
Yeah, I always thought maybe it would be better if UNESCO targets locations and then goes to the country and says, look, we're interested. We've done our research on this site that, is 1,000 years old, say, for instance, or 100 years old, and we really think it's an amazing place. Would you like us to add that to our UNESCO World Heritage Site? That would work a lot better for these underdeveloped countries that don't have the resources to be sending out paperwork and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, I think there probably is, there's an argument to look at something like that, I think. Probably part of the reason they don't do that is because they want buy-in from the countries. If a country goes through all of this effort to get one listed, it means they're much more likely to protect it. If UNESCO went along and said, we're going to add this to the list, will you protect it? And the country says, yeah, sure.
Yeah, right.
They may not be as committed in 5 or 10 years' time to that. Whereas because there is so much effort to do it at the moment, they really do protect them generally because, they wouldn't have gone through all of that otherwise. But I think you're right. I think there are probably ways to help countries get sites listed when they are important, but they wouldn't do it otherwise. Probably one of the other reasons they don't do it is that UNESCO is, I keep using the word political, but it also it has to be fair and balanced. It have to be very careful not to have any sense of bias there. And so there probably would be potential issues if a committee or an organization went around choosing countries to the detriment of others. But yeah, maybe they'll do that one day. I think they should a little bit as well. I agree.
I reckon it would be good. And did you hear, you obviously heard actually, the other day when Trump warned Iran that he was going to bomb the cultural site, and then he took that comment back. I think it was maybe via Twitter, I'm not sure. But what an idiot of a bloke.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been described as a war crime to do that kind of thing, and it's true. I mean, culture. But the funny thing is also attacking a country's cultural sites is actually also attacking the world's cultural sites, and that's what I think was, particularly ignorant and short-sighted of him. Just because something is in Iran and represents Iranian culture doesn't mean it's not also a part of our world culture. So you really are sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face by doing something like that. But if someone as ill-educated, ill-informed as him, it doesn't really surprise me. And Iran has actually a lot. I think it has 24 sites in Iran. So it's got more than, US and Australia and so on. There's a lot there, actually.
Have you gone to any of them or a few of them?
No. Every year I say it's going to be Iran this year. I'm going to go there and see a bunch of them, and then it never happens.
Not this year.
This is probably not the year to go, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, I have a few more questions, and I want to ask you some final questions. Have you still got a bit of time for me, Michael?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Well, I was just going to say, you can speed through these if you want to. With your UNESCO visits, do you have a little bit of criteria, or do you have some type of plan of action of how you plan to visit UNESCO sites? And also, I'll do it a double question, and which are your next sites that you want to visit?
So, in terms of how I choose the next one I'm going to see normally, a lot of the time it's just practicalities. Like I sort of do travel pretty much full time, but a lot of the time these days I'm not necessarily choosing where and when I'm going, because a lot of my travel is related to sort of work to do with my blog or so on. So,
Sure.
The short answer in that sense is I'll go to whichever ones are closest to where I am, and I'll do that. But if I have complete control over my travels, what I sort of tended to do for a while is to choose countries where I thought it was manageable to see all of them, so that I could kind of, I suppose, tick off a country, but actually see how they all fitted together. So, I'd go to like the Czech Republic, which actually has a bunch of amazing World Heritage sites, and it's not a particularly large country so you can go to the Czech Republic, and I spend a couple of weeks there and just sort of traveled around slowly and saw a bunch of things, but planned my itinerary so that I went to each of them along the way. And of course, it's easier to do that in Europe because, countries are relatively small. There's a high concentration or density of these sites, and the transport's quite good. But if I had sort of a bit more spare time, I would probably go and do a bit more of that, focus on European countries, and even just to get my count up, because, let's be honest, everyone likes to sort of have a list and cross things off and count things. And so, I haven't done many of the French ones or the Spanish ones. So, I could go and do Spain and France in a few months and get almost 100 more on the list.
You should do it. Do France.
If I have spare time, I will. I think I was always a bit busy. The next trip, I'm actually going on a trip in a couple of weeks to Cambodia, which is unrelated to World Heritage sites. I'm going for a particular project, but I've been to Cambodia a few times over the years, but they've added a new one since I was last there. So this is actually quite nice. But they only had two originally. Cambodia is a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, where a country that had, the Khmer Empire, quite an incredible civilization and lots of other sort of history and heritage, only has two sites in the whole country. But they have a third one now that was added a couple of years ago, which is a temple complex, but from a civilization from before the Khmer Empire. I don't know much about it, actually, but so I'll get to go to that one. And so I'll only be ticking off one World Heritage site, but I'll be getting one of my country counts back up to 100%. So that's always important as well in its own sense.
Oh, that's true, because it went down, to 50% because it gained a new heritage site?
I've been to two of the three, so it went down to 66% again. And so, it's only a bump. It always annoys me. And in fact, the Czech Republic has added a couple since I was last there to refer to the Czech Republic. So that's one I actually really want to go back to, just so I can go to the two or the three that they've added recently, so I can get back up to 100% with that one as well. Do
you ever hit any of these sites with a group, or is it always by yourself?
It's a mixture. Depends on how I'm traveling or and what's going on.
Sure.
I don't mind. I don't really have a preference of either seeing them alone or seeing them in a group in a general sense. But I don't actually like going with other people who aren't interested in them. And I've had this problem. If I'm on holidays with friends, I'll be like, "Oh, there's a World Heritage site. Let's go and see it." And it might be a big thing with lots of sort of different elements to it, and we'll be there for half an hour or an hour, and they'll be like, "Oh, that was great. Let's go." And I'll be like, "No, but this isn't how I do World Heritage sites. I need to, I need to see that part of it as well, because that's one of the reasons that it was listed, and so on." And so that annoys me. I need to make sure that people are as committed as doing the sort of geeky side of it as I am.
No, that's all right. And it would be remiss of me if I didn't actually ask you this question that I just thought of. What made you want to visit all the UNESCO World Heritage sites? What made you want to start ticking them all off? Because it's just crazy, man.
Yeah, I don't actually really have a very good answer to that. Well, I don't, because it's a silly thing to be doing in a sense. So I'll never really get there. But it kind of started initially. I sort of started traveling full time, and then it was only maybe 6 months or 9 months or so into it that I sort of came up with this idea. And it was because I realized that I was going to quite a lot of them, but I wasn't going to them because they were sites. And what was happening is I was missing these other ones that were kind of nearby that maybe weren't quite as famous. And so I was kind of like, well, what would happen if I started to make the effort to go and see these other ones that are quite accessible to where I am and where I'm going?
Yeah.
And that's when I started. It was when I was in South America. So, I was talking about Seoul mining town earlier. It wasn't at exactly that point, but it was around that point. And so I started to do things like that. I went to see that one and so on. And I was like, oh, wow, actually, this is really cool. And then it sort of became, although I'd already said that I was going to have the challenge, that's when the idea solidified in my mind. And I was like, no, this is the reason to do it. And I also found that I'm always very interested in history and heritage and culture generally. And I found that actually by creating these itineraries in a country where you did go to everyone, you actually learned a lot more about that country. Czech Republic is a great example. I went to these, I think there were 12 at the time I was there. I went to these 12 sites that I really had to make an effort to go and see some of them. But by the time I'd seen all 12 of them, I kind of understood the different eras in the country's history and how certain things fitted together and so on. Because you don't just see something, you learn something, don't you? I think that's one of the reasons people love traveling. This kind of traveling so much is because you can't go to these sites and not read things and talk to people and listen to a guide and come away with a better understanding. So, yeah, I think that's, even if I don't see every World Heritage site on the entire planet, I do like the idea of in each country trying to see every World Heritage site, because then you get, I think, a much, much broader understanding of that location.
Well, you got to see them all in Australia first, Michael.
Oh, yes. I need to set myself a timeline or a deadline for that, I think. Maybe I need to, the next year or two, I'll see them all. I don't think we have any new ones coming up. Australia doesn't actually have a plan to nominate any at the moment. So, I might have quite a few more years before I have to go and see another Australian one if I get them all ticked off now.
Well, I thought of one that could be nominated just off the top of my head. I heard that there was a section of the oldest Wollemi pines that was saved by the firemen in New South Wales, I think it is.
Yeah. That would be a really cool thing to do. Yeah. And in fact, I agree completely. I was going to say there is something which is called, we have the World Heritage List, as we know. We've been discussing that for an hour. There is also something called the Australian National Heritage List, which is something that the Australian government has put together, which is kind of like the World Heritage List of Australia, obviously. So it's not just the ones that are big enough or important enough to be on the World Heritage List. It's all the ones that we would have. And there are currently 119 places on this list. So if you wanted probably almost as difficult, but at least, you don't need a passport for it, challenge, you could go and see all 119 of our national heritage sites and see how you go with that. And I bet the Wollemi pines are probably on there or something like that.
Oh, they probably are, yeah. Oh, no, that's awesome, Michael. Well, I will ask you my final questions that I ask all my guests, and I really do thank you for coming on. But
my pleasure. It's been fun.
Thank you, sir. So if you could travel anywhere in the world now, where would you like to go?
I would love to say that I would want to do one of my top adventure travels I've never done and go to Antarctica, or I would love to say that I would go and explore the heritage of Iran. But honestly, I'd probably get away from the rain and the fires and go and lie on a beach in the Caribbean if I could right now, which is awful, but that's the reality.
It sounds like what I want to do too, which is pretty bad.
Yeah.
I just want to escape.
Yeah.
And obviously, and what would you be eating or drink? I'm guessing Caribbean, you'd be having some type of, I reckon you're a cocktail guy.
Rum. Yeah, if I was in the Caribbean, I'd just be doing rum for every meal. I did a cooking class when I was in Antigua in the Caribbean one time.
Oh, wow.
It was called Cooking with Rum, and this cook had taken all these traditional Antiguan recipes, and then she'd worked out ways to put rum into them. So every dish we cooked had a rum in it, and it was great.
That would have been great, but what a waste of good quality rum.
Well, I don't think we were using the good quality rum for the cooking. We saved that for the glasses to go with the meals. Yeah.
That's fair enough. So, wow. Okay. So you'd be eating something that you cooked and drinking rum. So it'd all just be a rum. It's all just rum, Michael.
Yeah. I'm not painting a very good impression of myself, am I?
Yeah. No, you're right, mate. You're right. And the final one, what's your favorite country and city, if you had to choose?
Oh no! This one's easy. My definitely favorite country in the world is Japan. I absolutely love it. I've been there probably 20 times in my lifetime.
Wow, that's so much.
Yeah, I know. I studied Japanese language in high school and sort of fell in love with the country then, and so I've sort of done lots of trips.
Wow.
Over the years, even sort of since then, but then particularly recently with sort of travel writing and travel blogging, Japan's such an important destination for Australians. I tend to go 3 or 4 times a year and do different regions. And that's why I love it so much. You can go back and back every time and find new things. Like, it's a relatively small island geographically, but it just has such an intensity of culture, but also nature. I love the way that they have managed to protect the heritage so well, but also become this zany, wacky, modern country, and it all sort of, fits together quite comfortably. Yeah, I just find it a fascinating place, and there's always so much to explore there. And Tokyo itself, you could go to Tokyo as many times as you physically could, and you'd always be discovering new things to do there.
Yeah, I might be going back this year. I've only been the once in 2016, I think it was, but it felt so alien when I got there. It was so alien. It's the strangest country I've ever visited. Well, no, it's a country that's actually put me outside of my comfort zone the most.
Oh yeah, I get that. Because the language is difficult as well. That's part of it. Yeah. But it's getting better with English. But it's a hard one to travel around. But then also just the culture. Everything about the culture is so different. So different. And I think that's kind of why I like it. That it is unique like that. That you go to Europe, and Europe has its own cultures and its own heritage. But you kind of know how it all works generally. It's not too dissimilar to how things work in Australia or the US or something. But Japan, it's all very different. Ordering your food from a vending machine before you go into the restaurant, and this and that. Even just staying alive is difficult. All the basics of eating and drinking and sleeping can be difficult.
Actually, talking about sleeping, have you been in one of those capsule hotels?
Oh yeah, I've done them a few times. They're actually quite.
What's that like?
It's actually fine. The only thing is you can only do it for one night. Like, you can't. Most of them don't actually allow you to leave your bag in your capsule. So it's kind of hard. Well, I think it's changed. To be honest, I think it's changed a bit now because they do have so many foreigners doing it to save money. But traditionally, the idea is it really is just for a businessman who's been stuck late at work or can't get home to sort of crash to sleep for a few hours before they get up and go to work again in the morning. And so you have your little capsule to sleep in, but there's obviously shared bathrooms and shared common areas and all of that. And you're supposed to clear out in the morning so they can come and clean everything before the next night a lot of people come through. Wow. But it's an experience. It's fun.
Yeah,
and it saves you money. They're quite cheap. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Well, comparatively, that's why I think a lot of tourists now do it, because you can save money that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome! What a great chat.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was really cool.
No worries, Michael. No, I really enjoyed it. Time Travel Turtle. I'll get it in there. Time travel turtle.
You've learned a lot about World Heritage sites now, haven't you? You didn't expect to hear about all the politics and the bureaucracy of it. You just thought we were going to talk about like cool places, but sorry to bring it down and make it so geeky and technical.
Nah, you're right, mate. I'm just going to look for the app now.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of it, but it's basically just called World Heritage or something like that.
World Heritage app. Okay. If anyone wants to contact you, what are the best ways for people to contact you?
It's come via my blog is the best way. So the blog is timetravelturtle.com, and that's got all my details there to find me on social media or send me a message through the blog or anything like that. That's the best way to do it.
Yeah, and you're on Twitter, and that's all on the website.
Of course, yeah, that's all on the blog. But yeah, if you like Twitter, @MichaelTurtle, Instagram is @MichaelTurtle. What else do we use? Facebook is Time Travel Turtle. But yeah, everyone's everywhere these days, aren't they? You can't can't get away from.
They are. And listener, if you want to see some really cool pictures, then do follow Michael on Instagram and Twitter and so forth, because they are fantastic. I need to comment more on them, Michael. I'm sorry. I apologize.
No, you're good. I'm
posting.
That's all I really want. I'm posting a World Heritage Site photo of the day every day this year as a new thing. So yeah, if you're interested in World Heritage Sites, now's a good time to follow me and check it all out.
And no government stuff, yeah? No government stuff.
No. This is just the fun things, yeah.
Okay, and if anyone wants to follow me, they know how to follow me. I'm on all the podcast apps. I'm on Spotify. I'm on Google Podcasts. I'm on iTunes Podcasts, if whatever that's called these days. My website's www.travelmanpodcast.com, and you can email me at travelmanpodcast@gmail.com. There you go. Awesome. You look, it should come second nature to me, but it never works out. The old outro.